All right, a couple more minutes, and people are strolling in from clinic and appointments. So thank you everybody for joining. Just a couple reminders to mute yourselves as you hop in, as you join. And if you're having connectivity issues, there is a phone number that you can call in, or by turning off your camera, that is also helpful. We are recording today's session, and I am going to let Kinney introduce our presenter for today. So thank you, Kinney, for joining us, and thank you, Allegra, for joining us.
Thanks, Sam. So welcome, folks. I'm glad you're able to join us today for the fifth Lunch and Learn today. And we'll be hearing from Allegra Hirsch-Wright, who is a colleague and a friend of Mervyn's. I'm grateful Allegra works in the Department of Clinical Innovation at Maine Behavioral Health Care and has expertise in both direct clinical practice as well as training, supervision, and implementation of evidence-based child trauma treatment models and trauma-informed practices. She holds national certifications. She's recognized as an expert in the field, both in Maine and nationally. She does serve on the Mervyn's Advisory Committee, and she's also an adjunct professor at the University of Southern Maine School of Social Work. So Allegra, welcome, and thanks for being here with us. It's great to welcome a colleague to speak today.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be able to chat with you all today. So really briefly, I just want to, before we start off, say a couple of things. The first is that we are going to be talking about adverse childhood experiences. We are going to be talking about trauma and various trauma events that we know that kids and families go through. And based on some of the numbers that we'll also talk about, what we also know is that the reality is that there's at least a handful of us, if not more, depending on how many folks are actually on, that have their own personal experiences with some of these events. And so some of the information that comes up may bring stuff up for you. And so I just want to say that I recognize that, and that I ask you to do and invite you to do whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. If that means turning down the volume for a little bit, or sort of taking a step away for a moment, or turning off your camera and taking a deep breath for a moment, that's absolutely fine. Do what it is that you need to do to take care of yourselves. And then the second thing that I want to say is that there's going to be some slides that I'm going to move through pretty quickly. They're more there so that you have them as information when you walk away from this Lunch and Learn session today. So some of the slides I'll absolutely be spending a little bit more time on and reviewing the content. Some of the slides I'm just going to go through very quickly, just because I think it's helpful to have that information there, but don't necessarily need to review it during our time today. So also just wanted to say that. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The other thing I'll say is you may see me looking sometimes to the side. It's because where the slides are on my computer, it's on this monitor here, but my camera is here. So, so that's what's happening. Okay. So we start off by, really sort of, this sort of general question of why are we talking about trauma, and specifically when we think about lactation and lactation support for moms who are breastfeeding or trying to breastfeed, why do we talk about trauma? So really, quite simply, it's because what we know is that many people, and if we narrow it down to thinking about moms that we're working with, many women have experienced trauma. And there are a couple of slides in a minute that talk about specific statistics, but really just quite generally, we know that excuse me, that many women have experienced trauma. We also know that trauma can impact the attachment and lactation experience, and we'll talk about why that is in a moment. And we know that that attachment and lactation experience can impact parent-child relationships and child development. And I know that these pieces are not anything that you all don't know and talk with parents about, talk with moms about when you're meeting with them, but it can be a helpful reminder. We also know that there are things that we can do to improve the attachment and the feeding experience and to help prevent re-traumatization. And that, and so we'll talk about some what some of those trauma-informed principles or trauma-informed approaches are. And then lastly, we know that trauma reactions can play out in the relationships that we have with the clients, with the patients that we're working with, the consumers that are coming in. And those interactions can impact us and our capacity to respond. And so it's really helpful to have a greater understanding of this thing that we call trauma, how it impacts us and those we're working with, and then what are some trauma-informed ways that we can respond that not only help the clients and patients that we're working with, but also will help us. Okay. So we're going to, again, review sort of the physiology of trauma and resilience. We're going to talk about the potential impact on maternity and maternity care and what that looks like. And then we're going to talk about some trauma-informed strategies for lactation and lactation support specifically. So to start off, there's this term that we call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And essentially, ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, comes from this study that was done, gosh, almost 30 years ago at this point, that really looked at sort of the connection between experiences that we may have had in our early childhood that were adverse, that were traumatic, and not good, and the impact that they have on us as we move throughout our lifespan. So really quickly, in case there's folks that haven't heard of the ACEs study, the ACE study was conducted by Kaiser Permanente, which is a private insurance company out in California, in partnership with the CDC. It asked about 17,000 participants that were really mostly the same. They were mostly white, mostly middle to upper class, all employed with private insurance, and all mostly college educated adults. And it asked them 10 questions about pervasive adverse events that may have happened to them within their caregiving system. So things that may have happened to them within the home. And they included questions related to whether they had a parent that was incarcerated, whether or not they saw their mother being hurt by their father potentially, or somebody in that role, asked about neglect, asked about physical abuse, sexual abuse. So sort of the traumas that we know typically occur within the caregiving system. And then it also asked about their health history. So whether or not they were experiencing cardiovascular disease, cancer, were smokers, experienced obesity, those kinds of things. And what this study found was that out of this group of 17,000, mostly white, mostly college educated, middle to higher to upper class folks, was that 2/3 reported experiencing at least one adverse event in their childhood. So maybe experienced physical abuse, or experienced sexual abuse, or witnessed domestic violence. What it also found was that 1 in 5 participants reported experiencing 3 or more of the adverse events. And what I want to sort of tease out really quickly is that when we talk about 3 or more events, it's not 3 or more instances. So if somebody checks off witnessing domestic violence, and they have 3, it's not that they've witnessed 3 different instances of domestic violence. It's that they have witnessed domestic violence, and they were physically abused, and they were sexually abused, let's say. And what it also saw was that when folks who reported experiencing 4 or more of the events, that significantly impacted and had really tremendous health implications on sort of our later health outcomes, and sort of whether or not we experience some of chronic or terminal illnesses, and or whether or not we adopt what we call health risk behaviors. So essentially, what this saw was what we sort of now use is sort of this pyramid that looks at when we experience an adverse event. And we'll tease this out a little bit more about why, but we know that then can disrupt neurodevelopment. And when that happens, we know that we can experience social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. When that happens, we oftentimes, in order to help alleviate or take some of the painful feelings, either actually physically or emotionally, out of that social, emotional, cognitive impairment, we oftentimes adopt health risk behaviors. We know that adopting health risk behaviors can increase our risk for disease, disability, and social problems, and that can, at some point, impact and lead to early death. Now, what I'll say, because if you're anything like me, when I was first learning about this information some years ago, I was sort of counting up in my head all of the sort of ACEs that I had. And started to get really panicked because I thought, oh my goodness, I am going straight for an early death. And so what I want to say is that, and we're going to talk about, mostly we're going to talk about this, is that all along the way, there are resilience building, trauma informed approaches that we can take when we interact with people that can disrupt this trajectory, so that even though somebody may experience an adverse experience in their childhood, it does not mean that they have to then stay on this path that could then lead them to an early death. So I really, I really find it important to make that clear, so we don't fall into this place of despair and that there's nothing we can do about it. So just to take a look a little bit closer as far as ACEs in Maine and what that looks like. So there's a study called the Behavioral Health or the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System that is done across the country. And in 2011, this was done in Maine. It's done sort of every few years, I believe. This study that we have from 2011 really shows, again, sort of in Maine, what things look like. So we know that at that time, about 4,000 Maine adults were asked these ACEs questions, so these sort of 10 questions of things that they may have experienced. We know that out of those almost 4,000 adults that responded, 63.5% of the adults reported experiencing at least one ACE. And what we also know is that almost 20% reported four or more. So again, when we talked about, when I just mentioned earlier, that there's even tremendous or significantly more tremendous health implications when we experience four or more ACEs, about 20% of Maine adults out of this study sort of reported that. What we also learned from the study specific to Maine is that females were more likely than males to report experiencing three or more ACEs, and that we also saw significant impacts related to somebody's sort of level of education. And it also, we can see that this breaks it down, sort of looking at that women experience higher numbers than men do in Maine. And then we also see the ACEs that were most often reported. And so in this one, what we see is that psychological abuse, so emotional neglect, essentially, that was the number one ACE reported by these adults that took this. And then having a parent that used substances or struggled with substance use disorder was the second one reported. I will say that out of some research that my team and I have done all along the way, is that we have found this to be very similar. We work with kids, and so it's been numbers that we've received from kids. And I'll say that the two traumas that they report the most, they toggle between emotional neglect and witnessing domestic violence. So when we look at overall numbers, and again, we're back to national numbers, when we look at numbers of thinking specifically of childhood abuse, especially sexual abuse, and we'll talk about in a moment why that's so significant when we think about maternity, when we think about giving birth, when we think about breastfeeding. So we know that 25 to about 40% of all women have experienced some form of childhood sexual abuse. The numbers, we can't really get a clear numbers because we know that there's a lot of folks that don't report for all kinds of various reasons. We know that 65% of those that do report some form of childhood sexual abuse, that 65% of those folks reported more than one experience. And 50% of those folks reported that the sexual abuse experiences that they had, that the perpetrator was a family member. Most often it's an adult family member, and most often it's a family member and an adult that child believes is there to take care of them and believes is one of the people or one of the adults in their lives that is going to keep them safe. So when we think about this, it makes sense that somebody who has experienced childhood sexual abuse, especially when the perpetrator is a family member, that we may have these really negative feelings about and towards our own bodies. So we may feel like our bodies are damaged. We may feel like we're evil. One of the things about that we know sort of just from basic body, how the body works is that our body responds to certain certain stimulus, to certain touches, whether or not we want the touch, like the touch, or don't want the touch or like the touch. And so oftentimes, folks that experience sexual abuse or sexual violence will talk about that they felt betrayed by their body because their body responded in a way that it made it seem like they were enjoying it when in fact they really weren't. And so they feel almost like their body is evil and has betrayed them, and feel a lot of guilt and a lot of shame around that. And what we know when we talk to women that have experienced this is that this significantly impacts the birth feeding relationship. And there are times where we see women who decide that formula feeding is better and safer for them because of either psychological injury that they've experienced, or sometimes even physical injury to their breasts from previous abuse that they've experienced. And so we talk about that, and we'll talk in a little bit more sort of about specifically how to work with moms sort of around that fact, but that is something to really keep in mind. So we also know that that women are at higher risk for experiencing intimate partner violence. So what we oftentimes hear interchangeably as domestic violence, but is really significantly specific to the perpetrator being their intimate partner. We also know that 9% of women experience intimate partner violence around the time and or during their pregnancy and or right after giving birth. This is a particular volatile time, actually, when there's domestic violence happening or intimate partner violence happening. We also know from statistics that 1 in 5 Mainers will experience sexual assault at some point in their life. So again, really sort of seeing the numbers specific to our community members in Maine and those that we might be working with. So really quickly, I think it can be helpful to have a little understanding of how stress impacts the brain, recognizing that then that's helpful to understand how trauma impacts the brain. So quite simply, and I'm going to show you, hopefully you can see, I'm going to hold my hand in front of the camera so you can see, because I'm going to use this model that actually comes from Dr. Dan Siegel called the hand model. And he uses this as he explains sort of how the brain works and how the stress response works on the brain when he's talking to kids and families that he works with. And I've used it and find it really helpful. So if we think about that, my hand sort of represents the brain. So this is the back of my head. Let's say this is the brain stem. If I were to turn it around, this would be my prefrontal cortex, or sort of right behind my forehead. So if I flip it around, sort of, again, back of my head, brainstem. So what we know is that if we open that up, that the very middle of the brain, the very sort of, and it's also the first part of the brain to develop, is sort of in the brainstem. It's often called the instinctual brain, the reptilian brain. Again, it's the first part of the brain to develop, and it's the part of the brain that really controls our survival. So it's the part of the brain that ignites and lets us know or activates when we're hungry, when we're tired, when we're cold, when we're too hot. And it also activates the fight, flight, freeze, or submit response that happens when a threat happens. So the fight is, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to fight this threat. The flight is, I'm going to take off, I'm going to run away from this threat. The freeze is, I'm going to freeze in the moment and hope that the threat gets bored of me and walks away. And the submit response is the, I'm going to do whatever the threat is asking, because that is ultimately what is going to save my life. And so that the reptilian part of the brain controls that as well. The next part of the brain to develop, I'm going to use my thumb to recognize. It's the amygdala. It's also sort of the limbic system. So it holds our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the stress response and the de-stressed response, essentially. That's the emotional. We also call that the emotional brain. And again, that's the part of the brain that really, when we realize we need to set off our reptilian brain, that's the part of the brain that then sets cortisol off so that we can then use whatever muscles we need to either fight, flight, freeze, or submit. And then the last part of the brain to develop, is my hand and my fingers coming over. And again, back here is the prefrontal cortex. So it's the cerebral cortex, the cortex, and the prefrontal cortex. This is the rational brain. This is the very last part of the brain to develop. It controls impulse control, rational thinking, being able to sort of really think out a situation, come up with some plausible sort of ways to be able to look at the situation and then make a decision. It's how we do sort of pro-con lists, all that kind of stuff. that part of the brain is not actually fully developed until where more recent research is really telling us till we're in our late 20s, for some folks even early 30s. So what happens when a stress response happens is, so we're sort of, let's say, walking along in sort of caveman times and a saber-toothed tiger jumps out in front of us. Essentially what happens is we flip our lid. Now, we don't literally flip our lid. We know our heads don't sort of flip back, although I think that would be kind of cool if it did. But what happens is our thinking brain, the rational brain, and even the emotional brain a little bit, they have to sort of quiet down, because what we need is our reptilian brain to immediately wake up and say, I'm going to fight the saber-tooth tiger, I'm going to run away, I'm going to freeze, or I'm just going to submit. And we need to do that in an instant, because if we don't, then whatever it is that's threatening us takes us over. And so we sort of, so Dan Siegel actually calls this the flipping your lid model. So if you were to look for this on YouTube, if you type in flipping your lid, this will come up, or flip your lid, this will come up. And so again, we sort of flip our lids so that our stress response can take over and we can then protect ourselves. And when the threat is over, we, because of things that we've learned in our childhood and then sort of experiences that we've had, we learn how to relax everything, and we can start to make sense of what's happening, and, oh, that was a real threat, or no, that's not a real threat. And okay, so now I can figure out what I need to do to sort of move through. And so we start to have rational thinking coming into play again. So what happens, though, is that something different happens when a trauma happens. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But first, we're going to sort of tease out what is trauma. So before I bring up the definition, just for like one moment, like 10 seconds, I just want you to think about and sort of think about what comes up for you when you hear the word trauma. So what are the different feelings that maybe sort of come up for you, that you imagine somebody might experience after having experienced a traumatic event? What are some ideas, or some when somebody sort of asks what is a traumatic event, what are some of the things that come up? And just sort of think about that for a moment, and then we're going to pull up the definition. Okay. So when we think about a trauma, what we know, and this definition comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, and we can tease this out a little bit later when we have time to chat, but essentially what the definition is, and I love this definition for a couple of reasons. They talk about trauma as sort of an individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as either physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So the first reason why I love this definition so much is because it really teases out that trauma is an event. So it can be a one-time event, what we often call an acute trauma. So things like a car accident, a dog bite, a school shooting. So those are things that typically when they happen, it's sort of a single event that happens. There may be repercussions that happen and sort of ripple effects that happen for days, weeks, months, even years afterwards, but the event happens and then it's over. There's also a series of events that happen, like experiencing physical abuse or sexual abuse, or witnessing domestic violence, or being bullied at school, where it's multiple events that happen over multiple days, multiple weeks, sometimes even multiple years. And then there's also a set of circumstances that sometimes in and of themselves are traumatic, like this collective trauma of a pandemic that we've all been living in for the last year and a half. And then there's also a set of circumstances that in and of themselves are not identified as trauma, but we know can bring about traumatic events. So things like experiencing homelessness, things like experiencing poverty. Although we don't consider poverty as a trauma, we know that when somebody is experiencing poverty, that there is trauma within that, and there are things that can come up from that. But we also know when we talk about set of circumstances, we're talking about things like institutional racism, systematic racism, historical trauma, all of those sort of the kinds of things that we know that we've always been dealing with, but certainly in the past year and a half, our country has really been its as it should really sort of being more brought to the forefront. So it's these various types of experiences that are experienced by an individual as either physically or emotionally harmful. So it doesn't have to be that I'm worried that my arm is going to get cut off. It could be that I'm worried that my safety is going to be taken away. And that it has lasting adverse effects on my functioning. And what I love about this piece is it doesn't just focus on my physical and social functioning, but it also talks about my spiritual functioning, recognizing that that is a huge piece for most of us, so many of us, and that experiencing trauma can absolutely impact that. Okay. So what happens when, again, a traumatic event happens is just like that stress response is we sort of flip our lids, our thinking brain quiets down essentially, and our doing brain takes over. Now, when somebody experiences multiple traumas, when somebody, or what we call sort of that set of circumstances, or or a set of events or multiple events like witnessing domestic violence, experiencing sexual abuse or physical abuse, or those kinds of things, their brain has a hard time coming back to that relaxed state because they always have to be on alert. So, if you think about sort of somebody witnessing domestic violence or experiencing domestic violence, oftentimes what victims talk about or survivors talk about is the sense of feeling that they have to walk on eggshells, like they never know when the perpetrator was going to go off and become violent. So they're walking around waiting, they're not relaxed. If you think about when you yourself have been in those moments where you're waiting for something bad to happen, almost like that feeling if you're somebody that likes to watch sort of scary movies and you know somebody's going to jump out and you're waiting for it, and so you can feel yourself tense up. So you're living in that state for so long. And then the only other state is you're then in the fight, flight, freeze, or submit response. And then you're right back into that hypervigilant waiting for it. So your brain never actually really gets the opportunity to relax fully, and you're always on alert. And when you're always on alert, what happens is that part of your brain gets really, really, really strong because all of the blood flow is going to that part of your brain. So you become really, really good at being hypervigilant and being on alert. And you have a harder time relaxing your brain, harder time with impulse control, harder time with thinking things through, because those parts of your brain did not get as much energy and as much attention as the survival part of your brain. So that's why we may see some of the things that we may see in some of the folks that we work with. So these are some of the trauma-related reactions that we may see, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these. But as you look through these, they sort of you may have heard sort of folks that you talk with or moms that you work with talking about some of these. They may be talking about sleep disturbances that are separate from what we know can happen when having an infant at home. You may see some avoidance, some detachment from their infant. We'll talk about that. You may hear in the way that they're talking that they truly believe that they have negative beliefs about themselves, about the world around them, about whether or not they are safe or whether or not they are constantly in danger. And so what we know is that when somebody has experienced sort of this complex or chronic trauma, that can lead to toxic stress because their stress response is always going off. And we know that when we experience toxic stress, that this can interfere with us being able to form secure attachment bonds. And when we think about as a child, if this is happening in our childhood, we're having a hard time securely attaching to our caregivers. And so we don't learn how to attach. And so later on, when we have our own children, we have to learn how to attach to that child. It's not, there's sort of this myth that especially if we give birth to a baby, that there's going to be this instant bond and connection, and that's actually not true. For a lot of women, that is learned, and for some of those women, it's because of their trauma experiences. So when we think about this, what are the significant impacts that we may see around trauma on maternity? And so the first thing I want you to do is, again, just think for sort of a split second about what are you seeing. So when you think about maybe what you would classify as some of the more challenging women that you work with, or some of the more maybe resistant women that you may work with, or some of the more maybe detached women that you may work with, what are some of the things that you're seeing? So just sort of think about that for a moment. And then in thinking about that, as you think about what we just talked about, and as we start to incorporate some additional pieces in a moment, I also want you to think about what might be coming up for some of these moms, um, that may be impacting or maybe leading to what you're seeing. So the first thing that I think it's helpful to remember is that there's no uniform response. So oftentimes one of the questions that myself and my team gets when we sort of talk about this with folks is, so what do I look for? What are the like top five things that I look for that if I see those, I know that person has experienced trauma? And the challenging thing is that there's things that we know generally, but it's not like if you see these five things, that automatically means. And if you don't see them, then that automatically doesn't mean. Because how somebody reacts and how somebody carries those reactions really depends on where they are in their own healing process. It depends on a lot of stuff that happened at the time that the traumatic event was happening, how old they were, their developmental stage. A lot of it depends on adversities that they may have experienced after the trauma or when reporting the trauma. So there's all kinds of things that play into that. What we do know, though, is that trauma can oftentimes impair a parent and a mother's ability to regulate their own emotions. And we also know that traumas can oftentimes cause parents to be triggered by medical stressors and or systems interventions. And so we're going to talk about sort of what we can do to sort of help decrease that sort of re-triggering that may happen. I also want to just talk about this additional trauma that we didn't mention earlier. I didn't mention earlier, but we also know really a lot of women experience is birth trauma and sort of trauma around their giving birth and what happened. And so when we look at some research about this, what we see is that about 25 to 34% of women report that their births were traumatic. And again, we know that the physiology of stress, complete with reminders, and at times, sometimes real danger, that they're sort of carrying this physiology of stress. So sometimes it was reminders, and sometimes it's actual real danger that may also be happening even after the birth. We know that birth trauma can increase the risk for postpartum symptomatology like postpartum stress, postpartum depression, for anxiety, for increased arousal and or increased so hypervigilance and or increased detachment. We also know that it increases the risk for attachment disruption. There's a lot of work now actually being done with women sort of when they're still, if they're giving birth in a hospital or a birthing center, if there is birthing trauma that happens, to be able to do some work right then and there with the mom and with the newborn around attachment and building some of those attachment skills, because we do see that disruption can happen sort of almost immediately. And then lastly, we know that it can cause some hesitancy in breastfeeding or trying to breastfeed. So when we talk about all this, what we recognize is that this can be sort of challenging because there's these extreme negative outcomes of trauma, but we also know that there's resilience and strength. And so when we talk about trauma-informed care, this is where we get to talk about and identify that resilience and strength, and can talk about how do we, in the work that we are doing and the little time that we may have with new moms, how do we build and support that resilience and that strength in them? So the solution essentially is trauma-informed care. So again, we go to SAMHSA for a really great definition, I think, and they sort of really define it as the strengths-based service delivery approach that's grounded in an understanding of and a responsiveness to the impact of trauma, and that really emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers, so those of us that are doing the work, and the survivors, so those of us that are coming in and utilizing our services. And that really creates the opportunity for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment, recognizing that one of the key components of trauma is that it is something that has happened to us. It is never something that we invite. It is never something that is our fault. And no matter what is going on. And because of that, what that means is it takes away our power and control. So essentially, when we think about trauma-informed care and the best way to go about this, there's all these conversations about, do you screen for trauma? Do you screen for ACEs? And there's a lot of conversation nationally around, there's sort of a big push around screening for ACEs and trauma. And now it's sort of leaning the other way because unfortunately, I think what happened is a lot of folks were screening, but not necessarily knowing what to do when they got yes responses. And so then providers struggled with that, survivors struggled with that. So now they're really looking at, when you screen for ACEs and trauma, that there's also a push to be screening for resilience and protective factors. But also this recognition that you don't even necessarily have to do that if we look at this as a universal precaution. And just like back when there was all this talk about universal precaution related to bloodborne pathogens, and we know that sort of when we're cleaning up a blood spill, for example, there's a specific way that we do it because we assume that the blood is contaminated. When we think about a trauma-informed approach, it's really this universal precaution and assuming that anybody that might be coming into utilizing our services, or anybody that might be a provider of our services, could potentially be a survivor of trauma. And so in that sense, it makes sense for me to use a trauma-informed approach. So when we think about really what that means, or what a trauma-informed system looks like, is essentially we talk about sort of the 4 R's. So a trauma-informed system realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands various paths to recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in not only the patients or the clients that we work with and their families, but also in the staff and the providers that are doing the work. And if we remember the statistics that 2/3 essentially of folks potentially have experienced at least one ACE, then we know that that's not just the folks that are utilizing the services, it's also the folks that we're working right next to. And we respond in a way that really fully integrates this knowledge, and we integrate it into our policies, into our practices, and into our procedures as a way to actively resist re-traumatizing those that we're working with. So these are the trauma-informed principles from SAMHSA. So we talk about, or they talk about safety. And when we talk about safety, we're not just talking about physical safety, although that's definitely key, but also talking about emotional and psychological safety. Talking about transparency and trustworthiness. So being really transparent and open and honest about what's happening, what's going to happen in policies and practices and procedures. Utilizing peer support, recognizing that the lived experience and the voice of the lived experience is really validating and healing. Thinking about doing and developing programs and practices and policies and systems in collaboration and working with, again, that lived experience. Providing opportunities for empowerment and for voice and choice. And then really keeping in mind of some of the culture, or not some, but the cultural, the historical, and the gender issues that we know are also intertwined in trauma and in experiences. And also thinking about sort of some of that historical trauma that I was talking about, and things like systematic racism and historical trauma with Indigenous people and some of those pieces. So when we think about how to sort of bridge culture to promote safe and supportive environments, thinking about that piece particularly, what we know is sort of really it looks like recognizing really many facets of diversity in culture, recognizing that certainly at the forefront of a lot of our minds is thinking about sort of racial and ethnic culture, but we know there's religious culture. And then we also know there's culture based on your family system that you were raised in, based on what state you were raised in, what area of the country, where in the state. We know there's a very different culture for folks that are down in the southern Maine area than there are that for folks in the northern Maine area. So thinking about those pieces as well. Understanding how your own identity, understanding what your own identity is and how you identify, and then how that impacts relationships with others. That also includes your own biases, recognizing that we all have biases. It's part of our makeup as humans. And then being able to identify provider and program changes and improvements to really facilitate safety within an awareness and appreciation of the cultures of the women and the children and the families that you work with. So when we think about strategies for engaging parents, moms specifically with trauma histories, again, we really think about establishing safety, establishing trust, making sure that there's opportunities for personal choice, opportunities for collaboration, and really specifically opportunities for hope. A lot of times, when somebody has experienced especially complex and chronic trauma, there can oftentimes be a lack of or a significant decrease in hope. Oftentimes we see or hear things like things just aren't going to get better. This is just the way it is in my family, or this is just the way that life is, and I just have to accept that it's always going to be this way. And so there's this lack of hope that there can be any change or any healing for them. And I strongly believe that for myself as a provider, no matter what sort of provider hat I'm wearing, that it's my responsibility to hold that hope for for that client, for that person in the time that they're with me until they're able to identify it and hold it for themselves. And so that's part of what I do. And I do that through empathizing with them, validating what's been going on for them, praising their areas of strength and the ways that they have survived. Because the reality is that if they're sitting there interacting with me, whether it's through Zoom or in person, they have survived, and that's huge. Providing information about the impact of trauma, doing a little awareness building. So many people don't necessarily know about trauma or identify that what they've experienced is an adversity or is trauma, or even and not even so much that they have to sort of be able to walk away with, yes, what I experienced is trauma, but even more so being able to walk away with the understanding of the way that I'm feeling and the reaction, the way that I react in some situations, and the thoughts that I have about myself and the world. That's really understandable given the experiences that I've had. That is what's most important. Not that they say, yes, that was trauma, but that they understand that their behaviors and their reactions and their thoughts and their feelings are not their fault. It's not because they're bad. It's not because they're crazy. It's because of what happened to them and what may still be happening to them. And then being able to link them to services, recognizing that you have, when you think about sort of the enormity of resources that they may need or may be connected to, or what's going to be helpful, and even just in general of thinking about being a new mom and the plethora of resources that can be really helpful for that. The work that you do is a very small piece of it. And I don't mean that in that it doesn't mean anything. It means a tremendous amount. But there's also other services that are going to be really helpful. And if you try and take on the responsibility for helping all of it or fixing all of it, that's going to burn you out, and that's going to really significantly impact you. So being able to say, this is what I can help you with, and I can connect you to other resources that can help you with those other things, is going to be best for everybody and produce the best outcomes for the mom that you're working with and for you as a provider. So when we think specifically about the impact of trauma on breastfeeding, recognizing that this is something that you talk with new moms about, it can be really helpful to remember that there can be reminders and triggers and emotions that come up. Breastfeeding is a very intimate act, as you know, and when we are involved in intimate acts, if we've experienced trauma, that can oftentimes be a time that reminders and triggers come up for us. There also may be there may be some moms who are comfortable with breastfeeding but really need significant privacy to do it, and recognizing that that's just not them just sort of being needy, but that there's a specific reason for it. It can also be painful, and not only because we know that sometimes it can be painful if a woman is experiencing pain sort of within her breast, but we know it can sometimes just be painful. That touch can be really painful, and sometimes startlingly so, in the sense that the mom's not necessarily knowing that it could potentially be painful. I mean, we don't necessarily talk about that. I remember when my son was born many years ago, what was talked about was the beauty of breastfeeding and nothing about sort of any negative pieces related to it. And it would have been helpful if I had known some of that, because again, that allows me to have a really informed decision, and then I know that my provider is being transparent with me, and that helps build trust. It may impact attachment. But interestingly enough, what oftentimes surprises folks is that when there's been studies done with women who have experienced especially significantly sexual trauma, that there's actually higher rates of those women initiating breastfeeding. So this is just to say again that we know that somebody's response to trauma can vary. And so even if you know that a woman has experienced sexual violence or sexual trauma, it doesn't necessarily mean that she's automatically going to be against trying or initiating breastfeeding. Again, what we also know the benefits of breastfeeding. I'm not going to read through every single one of these because I know that you know them, but it can be helpful, I think, as a reminder when you're talking with moms as a way to be able to use some specific language that can be really helpful and guide them in a way that even though when we know when you talk with them, it's not coming from a judging place, we know that that's sometimes how moms can hear it. And so it can be really helpful just to have these pieces right there. So again, we know that there's this breastfeeding debate. We know it comes partly, there's sort of the side of the mom and her feelings and knowledge and beliefs around breastfeeding. We know that there's the provider's knowledge and feelings and beliefs about breastfeeding. And when those combine, especially if they don't necessarily thread together, that can sometimes contribute to that mom's feeling of guilt, of sadness, of embarrassment, of fear of judgment. And so just sort of being aware of that, again, whether you know a trauma history or not, is sort of one way that we think about, think about that universal precaution. So I'm not going to go through these two slides. There's a couple of slides of attachment. These are really here just for you all as just additional pieces of resources and information. Just again, oftentimes it can be helpful to sort of share this with moms and sort of talk with them about attachment and about the benefits for it. And can talk about sort of how attachment is promoted even if they choose not to breastfeed. And so there's all kinds of ways that a new mom can attach with their new baby, even when they're choosing not to breastfeed. And so it can be helpful to have that piece of information. And really, what it comes down to is comfort, and how do we help new moms comfort their child. So trauma-informed lactation consultation, again, really thinking about the basics. It's about universal precaution, being sure to provide positive feedback about the mother's role in the process. So again, giving that mom some voice, some choice, and then really providing some positive feedback for using their voice and choice. Knowing the mom's history, worries, hopes, and expectations. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to ask about a trauma history, but you can even just ask, what was your experience? Do you know if you were breastfed? What is the experience in your family? What are the expectations in your family? Like, is any of that coming in? What are your worries? And what are your hopes that you get out of it? And then be able to have, again, sort of a transparent, open conversation about the best next steps for mom. Some simple ways to empower that mom. So really, again, listening to and addressing the fears and concerns, validating them for mom, offering a little bit of psychoeducation and validation around those trauma reactions, being able to, again, to really start with where they are and with what their goals and their desires out of the process is. Thinking about a term that we call low and slow, which is a way for ourselves to manage our own dysregulation if that starts to happen for us. And so it's a way for us to be able to facilitate our own relaxation and our own attunement and really staying there with mom. Because, this can be sometimes a hard conversation for mom. And especially if mom goes to a place of shame and guilt and embarrassment, they may start to emote with that. And sometimes it may be crying. Sometimes it may be anger directed at you, even though they may not really be angry at you. And so if we can keep our own emotions regulated, then that can help attune with them and can help keep them regulated as well. Providing voice and choice, if you're working with a mom and during a breastfeeding environment, asking before leaning in to assist and sort of always, making mom aware. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to touch you here. I'm going to place my hands here. Here's why I'm doing this, and being really open about that. And really being able to, in your words and in your and your actions, being able to reduce some of the shame and guilt that mom may feel. And so again, some ways to be able to, if breastfeeding really isn't possible, remember the cloth monkey goes back to, so there was an experiment that was done, an attachment experiment that was done with these monkeys, where they were given a cloth doll in sort of one part of the cage and food in another part of the cage, and their mother was removed from the cage, and the monkeys more often than not went to the cloth doll monkey than they did to the food, to the point that some of them even sort of were like starving, but much rather wanted the comfort and the safety that they felt from that cloth, doll, essentially, than they did from literally actually getting food. So it's really about remembering that it's really about comfort. And so if mom chooses not to breastfeed and they choose to pump, that they can focus on thoughts of their child, look through baby pictures, all of those kinds of things, to be able to elicit some of the happy hormones that can come out from that. And then again, co-regulating and really looking at and offering other ways for attachment, like serve and return, singing, talking, reading books to, all those kinds of things that we know are helpful. And last but not least, just thinking about and recognizing that patience is so key when we think about our own professional resilience, and that, working with families who've experienced trauma, again, whether you know it or not, can be challenging, but we also know can be really rewarding. It's really helpful to recognize that change happens slowly, sometimes so slowly that you may not even truly see all the change that you were hoping to see. You may never see the total outcomes of your effects, but what I will say is really trust that your simple and compassionate gestures are really important elements to healing and surviving. And I know this because not only do I know this from the work that I do and how I've seen it happen, but there's also scientific research that really shows that the number one protective factor for building resilience, especially after a traumatic event, is having at least one. For kids, it's at least one adult. For adults, I would say it's at least one person who is there to say in their words, in their language, I'm sorry that happened to you. It wasn't your fault. I value you. You have power. You have voice and choice. And I'm going to help keep you safe during the time that you're with me. And so when we do that, then what we know is that we're really doing that universal precaution. We're utilizing that trauma-informed approach, and we are helping support resilience building and healing for those that we're working with. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to, I think, maybe stop sharing my slides so that if folks want to ask questions, we can see some folks, if that sounds okay to Keeney and folks.
Thanks so much, Allegra. So if folks have any questions of Allegra, we have a few more minutes before you sign back off. I think you would have to unmute yourself. Is that what you prefer? I think that's best if you just want to unmute, or if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you. Thank you so much, Allegra. It was a wonderful presentation.
Absolutely.
I don't.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I don't have any questions, but I love the presentation. I think it was very informative, and I was actually listening to a podcast regarding childhood trauma. So this definitely made a lot of good points regarding that. Going back to that podcast. So really loved it. I love it.
Thank you.
And it's very informative too. Thank you.
Absolutely, you're welcome, and thank you. And what I was going to say is that I am oftentimes the person where when I sit in one of these, I take in so much information and then I go back and process it and think about it, and then I come up with questions. So if that's the case for you, Keeney, I'm fine if you want to share my email address, and then that can be shared with folks. I know that because I don't think they're on the slides, but I am always open to folks sending me an email. If you have a question later on, if you're looking for a particular resource, feel free to email me. I'm happy to respond to those.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allegra.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say thanks so much for coming. We're in the process of becoming trauma informed, and this was just another piece of that pie, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for making these lunch and learns available as well. I know that folks are multitasking during this hour, but it's a gift to just relax and listen. And Allegra has really brought a lot of value to her work nationally and within the state, and to now share it with WIC. So we're grateful. Okay.
Glad to be able to.
Yeah. Oh, it looks like maybe one new message here. A big thank you. Thanks, Allegra. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Allegra. Thanks, Kenny. Thanks, Ruby.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Thank you. Nice to meet everyone.
Bye.
Good to see you, Keeney.
Yeah, good to see you, Allegra. Thank you.